There is a darkness beneath the earth that holds more color than the sun-bright world above. A darkness that, when illuminated, reveals chambers of such otherworldly beauty that the human mind struggles to process them as real, as natural, as anything other than the set design for some celestial opera or the fever dream of a painter who has never learned the word restraint. This is the paradox of the Reed Flute Cave, located in the karst mountains near Guilin in southern China, a place that is both entirely natural, formed over geological epochs by nothing more than water and stone and time, and yet so visually overwhelming, so impossibly ornate, so saturated with shape and color and texture that it feels constructed, intentional, impossible. Step through the entrance carved into the hillside northwest of Guilin's city center, and the world changes. The thick, humid air of subtropical China gives way to the cave's constant coolness, a steady temperature that hovers around 18 degrees Celsius year-round, a refuge from summer heat and winter chill. The light of day recedes behind you, and as your eyes adjust to the artificial illumination within, and we must talk about that illumination, that controversial, magnificent, garish, beautiful decision to bathe these chambers in colored light, you begin to see what water has wrought over 180 million years. The cave stretches approximately 240 meters into the hillside, though the tourist route, winding and circling back on itself, covers nearly 500 meters of pathway. The ceiling heights vary dramatically. Some passages require ducking, though most have been excavated or selected for their comfortable proportions, while the largest chambers soar to heights of 18 meters or more, cathedral spaces hollowed from solid limestone. And every surface, every wall and ceiling and pillar is textured with mineral deposits, with formations that have grown at the pace of millimeters per century, that represent timescales so vast that human history, all of it, all 5,000 years of our recorded civilization, is less than 3% of the cave's age. But even before we speak of stalactites and stalagmites, of flowstone curtains and halictites, and all the vocabulary of cave formations, we must speak of the light. Because the Reed Flute Cave, in its modern incarnation, is not experienced in the feeble beam of a flashlight or the romantic glow of lanterns. It is experienced in technicolor, in a light show that would make a 1970s rock concert seem subtle. Reds and greens and blues and purples and golds wash over the formations, sometimes individually, sometimes in combinations, sometimes shifting and changing, transforming the perception of the space from moment to moment. This lighting system was installed in 1962 after the cave was opened to tourism. It represents a distinctly Chinese aesthetic approach to natural wonders, an embrace of enhancement, of making explicit the beauty that is implicit, of adding human artistry to natural form. Western cave management tends toward white light, toward showing the cave as it is, toward a philosophy that human additions should be minimal and invisible. The Reed Flute Cave takes the opposite approach. The lighting is not just illumination, but interpretation, not just revealing, but transforming, making the cave not into a museum piece preserved in aspic, but into a living work of collaborative art between geology and humanity. The effect is controversial. Purists argue that the colored lights obscure the natural beauty of the formations, that they are garish and tacky, that they represent the worst kind of tourist kitsch. Others find them enchanting, argue that they draw attention to details that white light would wash out, that they create an emotional and aesthetic experience that would be impossible with natural presentation. Both perspectives have validity. The Reed Flute Cave with its colored lights is a different experience than the Reed Flute Cave in darkness would be, or in neutral illumination. Whether it is better or worse is perhaps the wrong question. It is simply what it is. A choice made, a vision executed, an interpretation that has become inseparable from the cave itself. As you move deeper into the cave, following the paved pathway that curves and climbs and descends through the chambers, the formations accumulate in density and variety. Stalactites hang from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, like the fangs of some sleeping stone dragon, like organ pipes awaiting a player. Stalagmites rise from the floor to meet them, growing upward at the same infinitesimal pace, destined in some cases to eventually connect and form columns, pillars of stone that bridge floor and ceiling, that have taken millions of years to achieve. Flowstone drapes the walls, smooth and rippling like fabric despite being solid mineral, patterns frozen in mid-flow. And everywhere, the texture, rough and smooth, crystalline and matte, wet and dry, the surface of the cave alive with variation. The formations have names, of course. Every famous cave does this, identifies specific features, anthropomorphizes them, creates a narrative to guide visitors through otherwise overwhelming visual complexity. The Reed Flute Cave has dozens of named formations: the Virgin Forest, the Dragon Pagoda, the Crystal Palace of the Dragon King, the Red Silk Drapes, Mushroom Mountain, the scholar studying his books. Some of these names are ancient, appearing in the ink inscriptions that date back over 1,000 years. Others are modern inventions, created when the cave was developed for tourism, chosen to resonate with Chinese cultural references, to connect the stone to mythology and literature and the shared imagination of the culture. But before we walk through the chambers, before we examine individual formations and discuss mineral chemistry and formation rates, we must step back. We must understand where this cave came from, how it came to be. We must descend into deep time, into the Paleozoic era, when this region was beneath a warm, shallow sea. We must watch as countless marine organisms lived and died, their calcium carbonate shells and skeletons accumulating on the seafloor, compressing over millions of years into thick beds of limestone. We must see this seafloor lifted, thrust upward by tectonic forces, emerging from the ocean to become land, then mountains, then the peculiar landscape called karst. Karst, the word comes from a region in Slovenia, but the phenomenon is global. Any place where you have thick limestone deposits, sufficient rainfall, and enough time for water to do its work. The chemistry is simple. Rainwater, naturally slightly acidic from dissolved carbon dioxide, percolates through soil and becomes more acidic as it interacts with organic matter. This weak carbonic acid encounters limestone, calcium carbonate, and slowly dissolves it. Not dramatically, not quickly, but with patience measured in millennia and eons. The water widens existing fractures, creates channels, hollows out spaces. Over time, the solid stone becomes perforated, becomes porous, becomes a maze of passages and chambers, a hidden architecture of void spaces within the rock. The Guilin region of southern China is one of the world's most dramatic karst landscapes. The peaks that rise from the flat plain, steep-sided, vegetation-covered, shaped like haystacks or towers or the humps of buried dragons, are the erosional remnants of a once continuous limestone plateau. The flat areas between the peaks were dissolved away, removed by that patient chemical reaction between acidic water and soluble stone. What remains are the towers, spectacular and strange, creating a landscape that has inspired Chinese painters for centuries, that appears in countless scroll paintings, that defines the aesthetic of Chinese mountain landscape in the global imagination. And within these peaks, hollowed by the same processes that shaped the external landscape, are caves. Hundreds of them in the Guilin area, thousands if we count every small cavity and passage. Most are unremarkable, of interest only to geologists and bats, but a few are spectacular, large enough and decorated enough to draw visitors, to become destinations, to be named and lit and interpreted. The Reed Flute Cave is among the finest of these, not the largest, not the most scientifically significant perhaps, but certainly among the most visually striking, the most elaborately decorated with secondary mineral formations, the most transformed by its lighting into something that transcends simple geology and becomes experience, becomes art, becomes a space that operates on both material and emotional registers. The cave's Chinese name is Lu Di Yan, which translates directly as Reed Flute Rock or Reed Flute Cave. The name comes from the reeds that once grew outside the entrance, reeds that could be fashioned into flutes, creating music from the plants that thrived on the hillside above the hollow chambers. It is a poetic name, appropriate for a cave that has attracted poets for over a millennium, that has been the subject of verses and paintings, that has accumulated layers of cultural meaning to match its layers of mineral deposition. But the cave is older than any human names, older than our species. The limestone that contains it formed during the Devonian and Carboniferous periods, roughly 360 to 300 million years ago. The hollowing out of the cave chambers likely began much more recently, perhaps 180 million years ago during the Jurassic period, when this region had the right combination of uplift, climate, and hydrology to initiate large-scale karst formation. The specific formations we see today, the stalactites and stalagmites and flowstone, are younger still, probably less than 1 million years old, though dating cave formations is notoriously difficult and any ages given should be understood as estimates with significant uncertainty. What we can say with confidence is that the cave formed slowly, patiently, through processes that operate at rates that make human timescales seem like frantic rushing. A stalactite grows at a rate measured in millimeters per century under typical conditions. The largest formations in the Reed Flute Cave, several meters in length, represent hundreds of thousands of years of continuous growth. And that growth can be interrupted if the water supply changes, if the cave dries out, if the delicate chemistry shifts, growth stops. It can resume later if conditions return to optimal, but there is no guarantee. Many formations show evidence of multiple growth phases, of periods of activity separated by periods of dormancy, the geological equivalent of a manuscript written, abandoned, returned to years later, written some more. The cave has been known to humans for at least 1,200 years and probably much longer. The earliest dated inscriptions are from the Tang Dynasty, from the year 792 CE, though there are others that may be older, their characters too worn or obscure to date with certainty. These inscriptions are remarkable documents. Over 70 of them survive, brushed onto the cave walls in ink by visitors who wanted to leave a record of their presence, who wanted to add their names to the stone, to claim a small immortality by writing on something that would last far longer than they would. The inscriptions vary in content and style. Some are simply names and dates. Zhang so-and-so visited this cave in the 3rd year of such-and-such emperor's reign. Others are more elaborate, poems or observations about the beauty of the formations, attempts to capture in words what the eyes were seeing. Many reference the cave as a place of refuge, a sanctuary from the troubles of the world above. This theme recurs throughout the historical record, the cave as hideaway, as shelter, as escape from war or persecution, or simply the ordinary difficulties of life. During the Tang Dynasty, when many of these inscriptions were made, China was at a cultural zenith. Poetry and painting flourished, trade along the Silk Road brought wealth and ideas. The empire was vast and relatively stable. Yet even in such times, individuals sought out caves, sought darkness and solitude and the strange beauty of underground chambers. What drew them? Perhaps the same thing that draws visitors today, the otherworldliness of it, the sense of being in a space utterly unlike the ordinary world, where normal rules of scale and form and texture do not apply. Some inscriptions suggest the cave was used for religious purposes. Taoism and Buddhism both have traditions of cave meditation and retreat. The darkness, the isolation, the constant temperature and humidity, the soundlessness broken only by the drip of water. These qualities make caves ideal for contemplative practice, for the kind of sustained inward focus that spiritual traditions value. There are references in some inscriptions to meditation, to seeking enlightenment, to the cave as a place where the boundary between material and spiritual, between earth and heaven, becomes permeable. Other inscriptions are more practical, recording visits by officials or merchants, by people passing through the region who heard of the cave and stopped to see it. The Guilin area has long been an important transportation corridor. The Li River provides water transport, and several land routes pass through the region, connecting southern China with the interior. Travelers would have heard stories of the remarkable cave, and some would have taken the time to visit, to descend into the earth and see for themselves what water and stone had created. And then, for centuries, the cave seems to have been largely forgotten. The inscriptions peter out after the Tang and Song dynasties. Whether the entrance became blocked, or whether people simply stopped visiting, or whether the cave was known only to locals who did not bother to write about it, we do not know. But it fades from the historical record, becomes a footnote, a local curiosity if it is remembered at all. The modern rediscovery came in 1940 during the Second World War. Japanese forces were advancing through China, and refugees fled before them, seeking any kind of shelter, any place where they might be safe from bombing and ground assault. Some of these refugees found the Reed Flute Cave, found its entrance hidden on the hillside, and recognized it as shelter. The cave could not be bombed. It was protected by meters of limestone. It was cool in the brutal summer heat. It had fresh water from the seepage that fed the formations. For a time, it housed families, children, elderly people, all seeking refuge from war. One imagines their experience, living in darkness or by candlelight, children playing among formations that took millennia to form, families sleeping on the stone floor, the cave echoing with voices and the small sounds of human habitation. It must have been difficult, uncomfortable, frightening, but it was safe, safer than the world outside, and that safety was precious enough to make the hardships worthwhile. After the war, the cave returned to obscurity for a time, but the refugees had talked about it, had described the formations and the inscriptions and the sheer size of the chambers. And as China stabilized and began to develop economically, as tourism emerged as an industry, someone remembered the cave and recognized its potential. In 1959, the decision was made to develop the Reed Flute Cave as a tourist destination. Pathways were constructed, lighting was installed, guides were trained, promotional materials were created, and in 1962, the cave opened to the public. The transformation was dramatic. What had been an obscure natural feature known only to a few locals and preserved in ancient inscriptions became one of Guilin's premier attractions. Visitors came by the thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands per year. The cave that had spent millions of years in darkness, interrupted only by occasional visitors with torches or candles, was suddenly lit continuously, walked through by crowds, subjected to the noise and heat and humidity of constant human presence. This had consequences. The lighting system, while spectacular, created a new ecosystem in the cave. Algae began to grow on surfaces near the lights, feeding on the constant illumination, turning white calcite green in places. The formations began to darken from the oils transferred by touching hands, despite signs and barriers meant to prevent contact. The cave's atmosphere, its temperature and humidity and carbon dioxide levels, changed in response to the HVAC systems installed to make the visitor experience comfortable. The air that had been still for epochs began to circulate in new patterns. Yet the cave endures. Stone is patient. The formations that took hundreds of thousands of years to grow are not significantly damaged by a few decades of tourism, not yet at least. The algae can be cleaned, though it grows back. The touching can be prevented with better barriers and stricter enforcement. The atmospheric changes can be mitigated with careful environmental management. The cave is robust on geological timescales, even if vulnerable on human ones.
And the cave gives something in return for these impacts. It gives wonder, it gives beauty, it gives that moment when you round a corner and see a chamber lit in blue and purple, stalactites descending like frozen waterfalls, stalagmites rising to meet them, and your breath catches because it is so much more elaborate, so much more intricate, so much more impossibly detailed than you expected. It gives the experience of standing in a space that is genuinely ancient, that was formed by processes operating over timescales that make human history seem instantaneous. It gives perspective, humility, a sense of the vastness of geological time and the power of simple chemical reactions given enough time to operate. Let us walk through the cave now, chamber by chamber, formation by formation. Let us follow the pathway that millions have followed, that winds through the hollow heart of the limestone hill. We will start at the entrance, with the light of day still visible behind us, and descend into the depths, into the most elaborately decorated chambers. We will speak of what we see, of how it formed, of what it means, and we will end at the exit, emerging into daylight again, changed in some small way by what we have witnessed. The entrance passage is relatively narrow, a gateway that creates anticipation. The walls here are less decorated than deeper in the cave. This is the zone most affected by surface conditions, where temperature and humidity fluctuate seasonally, where growth conditions are less optimal. But already you can see the texture of the limestone, the way water has etched and sculpted it, the small formations beginning to appear on the ceiling. As you proceed deeper, the passage opens into the first significant chamber. This is called the Crystal Palace of the Dragon King in some guides, though different sources use different naming schemes and there is not always consistency. What matters is not the name, but the reality. A space perhaps 10 meters wide and 15 meters high, its ceiling covered with stalactites of various sizes, its floor rising in stalagmites, some of which have merged with descending stalactites to form complete columns. The lighting here is predominantly blue and green, cool colors that emphasize the stone's texture and create an underwater ambiance. This is deliberate. Many of the named formations reference water, rivers, oceans, the homes of dragons and water spirits. The colors reinforce these associations, make the cave feel like a submerged palace, a drowned city, a place that belongs to another element despite being surrounded by stone. The formations in this first major chamber are diverse. Some stalactites are smooth and uniform, perfect cones descending from the ceiling, their tips dripping water that falls onto matching stalagmites below. These are active formations, still growing, still being shaped by the endless deposition of calcite from the seeping water. Millions of drips over millennia build the formation millimeter by millimeter. Other formations are inactive, no longer receiving water, their surfaces dry and often darkened by dust and age. These inactive formations are archaeological in nature, preserving information about past conditions, though reading that information requires sophisticated analysis. Some formations are ribbed or fluted, showing the effects of water flowing down their surfaces rather than dripping from their tips. These are called draperies or curtains when they are thin, wavy sheets of stone, or flowstone when they are thicker and more massive. The colors vary. Most formations are white or cream or light brown, the natural color of relatively pure calcite. But where other minerals are present in the water, iron compounds, manganese, copper, the formations can be stained orange or red or black or blue. The Reed Flute Cave has representatives of all these variations, creating a palette that even without artificial lighting would be remarkably diverse. You move deeper. The pathway climbs now, following the natural floor contours, bringing you into a higher chamber. The formations here are denser, more elaborate. Stalactites cluster so thickly that they merge into continuous sheets descending from the ceiling. Stalagmites rise in forests, some thin as fingers, others massive as tree trunks. Between them, the floor is rough with smaller formations, with the lumpy deposits called cave popcorn or cave coral, tiny bumps of calcite that form through a different mechanism than stalactites, growing from moisture that seeps through the cave walls rather than dripping from above. This chamber is lit primarily in amber and gold, warm tones that bring out the browns and tans in the stone. The effect is completely different from the cool blues of the previous chamber. This space feels warmer, more intimate, despite being larger. The lighting creates shadows between the formations, emphasizes depth and three-dimensionality, makes the space feel inhabited, as though something might be moving in those shadows, might be watching from behind that cluster of stalagmites.
One of the named formations here is called the Virgin Forest, a grove of tall, thin stalagmites that do, with a bit of imagination, resemble a stand of trees. They are not uniform. Some lean slightly, some are taller, some are thinner. This variation is entirely natural, resulting from slight differences in water flow, in the exact chemistry of the seeping water, in the microtopography of the cave floor where they began growing. But the effect is uncannily organic, like a petrified forest, like trees turned to stone by some magical curse. Beyond the virgin forest, the path descends into a lower passage. The ceiling here is lower, the space more confined. This creates a sense of compression, of being deeper in the earth, though you are actually still relatively close to the surface. The formations in this passage are different in character, more horizontal than vertical, more flowed than dripped. The walls are covered in flowstone, smooth sheets of calcite that look like frozen waterfalls, like mineral fabric draped over the rough limestone beneath. In some places, the flowstone is so thin it is translucent, and when lit from behind, it glows, the light filtering through the layers of calcite like light through alabaster. This is one of the most magical effects in the cave, these glowing panels of stone, barely thicker than paper in places, alive with transmitted light. The effect is entirely dependent on the artificial lighting, would not exist without it. Whether this is authentic to the cave's nature or a distortion of it is, again, a matter of perspective and philosophy. The passage opens suddenly into what is arguably the cave's most spectacular chamber, the largest and most elaborately decorated space in the entire system. This is the chamber most often featured in photographs, the one that appears on promotional materials, the one that justifies the visit for many tourists. It is approximately 18 meters high, perhaps 30 meters wide, and perhaps 40 meters long, dimensions that are difficult to judge in the colored light, with formations obscuring sightlines, with the irregular walls and ceiling making measurement approximate. And it is filled with formations. Stalactites descend from the entire ceiling, some small as icicles, others massive as columns. Stalagmites rise from the floor to meet them, and in many places they have connected, forming pillars that bridge the space, that support nothing structurally, but seem to hold up the ceiling symbolically, architecturally. Between these major formations, every surface is textured with secondary deposits, with the endless elaboration that water and minerals create given enough time. The lighting in this chamber is complex, with multiple colors applied to different formations, creating zones of color that blend and shift. One massive stalagmite, perhaps 8 meters tall, is lit in red, creating the effect of a giant candle or a furnace glowing in the darkness. Others are blue, green, purple. The ceiling is washed in cool colors, the floor in warm ones. The overall effect is overwhelming, almost chaotic, saved from tackiness only by the genuine magnificence of the formations themselves, by the fact that no amount of colored light can diminish the reality of what water has accomplished here. This is the chamber often called the Crystal Palace of the Dragon King, referencing Chinese mythology, connecting the cave to the stories of dragons who live beneath mountains and oceans, who control water and weather, who are sometimes terrifying and sometimes benevolent. The formations do lend themselves to these associations, the massive pillars as the palace's columns, the descending stalactites as chandeliers, the flowstone curtains as silk drapes in a royal hall. It is fantasy projection, certainly, but fantasy that the space invites, that seems appropriate to the scale and elaboration of what you are seeing. You spend time in this chamber, or you should. Moving through too quickly means missing details, missing the smaller formations that are as remarkable in their way as the massive ones. On one wall, a series of thin stalactites descends in parallel, like the pipes of an organ, their spacing regular enough to seem intentional. On another, flowstone has created ripples and ridges that mimic the patterns of wind-blown sand or water-carved rock, despite being formed by completely different processes. The ceiling in one area is covered with cave popcorn, those small, bumpy deposits that result from seeping moisture, creating a texture like stucco or rough coral. And everywhere, the play of light and shadow, the way the colored illumination transforms the perception of form and space. A formation that appears solid in one light becomes translucent in another. A stalactite that seems small suddenly reveals itself as massive when you get closer or when the lighting shifts. The chamber is not static. The lights fade and change, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, creating a sense of movement and life in what is actually perfectly still stone. Eventually, reluctantly, you move on. The path continues through narrower passages, through smaller chambers that are nonetheless remarkable, through spaces where formations cluster so densely you must walk carefully to avoid touching them. Some of these passages are lit more subtly, with white or amber light that seems restful after the intensity of the major chambers. This variation in intensity is important. The constant bombardment of color and form would be exhausting without these quieter interludes.
One chamber contains a formation called the Red Silk Drapes, a wall of flowstone tinted orange and red by iron compounds in the water. It descends from ceiling to near floor in smooth folds, looking genuinely like heavy fabric, like curtains in an emperor's palace. The illusion is so complete that you want to reach out and touch it, to see if it really is stone, to test whether something that looks so much like cloth can truly be mineral. But you don't touch, or shouldn't. The oils from human skin transfer to the calcite, darkening it, changing its appearance, accumulating over thousands of touches into visible damage. Another formation, called Mushroom Mountain, is a cluster of unusually shaped stalagmites, their tops flattened and wider than their bases, creating a silhouette that does genuinely resemble mushrooms. This shape is somewhat unusual. Most stalagmites are cone-shaped, widest at the base and tapering toward the top. These inverted proportions likely result from specific water flow patterns, from drips that spread out as they hit the formation's surface, depositing calcite in a wider pattern at the top. It's a reminder that while we understand the general principles of cave formation, the specific shapes can be endlessly variable, resulting from the unique combination of factors at each location. The tour continues. There are perhaps a dozen major chambers and as many connecting passages, each with its own character, its own named formations, its own lighting scheme. After a time, you might feel a sensory overload. There is simply too much to process, too many surfaces and textures and colors and forms. This is perhaps why the cave tour is timed and guided, why visitors move through in groups at a controlled pace.
Without structure, people might become overwhelmed, might rush through trying to see everything and actually seeing nothing, or might linger too long in one chamber and not reach the others. Near the end of the tour route, there is a chamber called the Scholar Studying His Books, or sometimes the Old Poet at His Desk. A large stalagmite, perhaps 3 meters tall, has a roughly flat top, and nearby a cluster of smaller formations might, with generous imagination, resemble piled books or scrolls. This formation connects the cave explicitly to Chinese literary culture, to the tradition of scholar poets who retreat to nature to study and contemplate, who seek inspiration in mountains and rivers. Whether the connection is genuine or forced doesn't really matter. It exists now, is part of how the cave is understood and interpreted. The final chamber before the exit is smaller, more intimate. The lighting here is softer, predominantly blue and white, creating a calm space after the intensity of the earlier chambers. Some formations here are particularly delicate, thin soda straws, hollow stalactites barely thicker than a pencil that hang from the ceiling. These are fragile, can be broken by touch or even by strong air currents. Their presence indicates that this area has been relatively protected, has not experienced the kind of disturbance that would damage such delicate structures. And then the pathway turns upward, begins the return to the surface. The exit is through a different opening than the entrance, and as you climb toward it, the artificial lighting fades, replaced by the growing brightness of natural daylight. The transition can be jarring. Your eyes have adjusted to the cave's dimness, and the outside world seems almost painfully bright. You emerge onto a hillside, looking out over the landscape, the Li River visible in the distance, other karst peaks rising from the plain. You have been underground for perhaps 40 minutes to an hour, depending on the pace of your tour group. In that time, you have traveled through chambers that took hundreds of thousands of years to form, have seen formations that represent timescales so vast as to be almost meaningless. And you have seen them transformed by human interpretation, by the decision to light them in colors, to name them, to create a narrative and aesthetic experience around them. What have you learned? What do you take away from the experience? These questions have no single answer. Every visitor experiences the cave differently, brings different expectations and contexts, leaves with different memories and impressions. Some are moved by the geological timescales, by the sense of deep time made visible. Others respond primarily to the aesthetic beauty, to the colors and forms, and the almost surreal quality of the illuminated chambers. Some appreciate the cultural connections, the ancient inscriptions, the Chinese literary and mythological references. And some, honestly, are simply checking off a tourist attraction, seeing something because it is famous and recommended without deep engagement or lasting impact. But the cave doesn't care. Like all natural features, it exists independent of human observation and interpretation. The formations were growing long before humans entered the cave, will continue growing, if conditions remain suitable, long after tourism ends, long after perhaps our entire civilization has passed into geology, become a thin layer in the stratigraphic record. The cave operates on geological time, and on that scale, the entire span of human interaction with it, from the first Tang Dynasty visitors to the present mass tourism to whatever future awaits, is an eye blink, a momentary disturbance in processes that operate across eons.
Yet human meanings matter too. The cave as we experience it is not just the cave as it physically exists. It is the cave filtered through culture and interpretation, through the decisions to light it in certain ways, to name formations, to write about it, to remember it. The physical cave and the cultural cave are inseparable in practice, even if we can separate them conceptually. When you remember the Reed Flute Cave, you remember both the stone and the light, both the natural formation and the human interpretation, both the cave and the experience of the cave. The tension between preservation and access, between allowing people to experience natural wonders and protecting those wonders from the impacts of that experience, is inherent and unresolvable. Every visitor to the cave has some impact, breathes air that changes the cave's atmosphere, generates heat, potentially touches formations, introduces microorganisms and organic compounds that wouldn't otherwise be there. Multiply this by hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, and the cumulative impact becomes significant. Yet denying access means denying the experience, means the cave exists only for the abstract principle of preservation rather than for actual engagement and appreciation. Different cultures and philosophies weight these values differently. Western environmental thought often prioritizes preservation, sometimes to the point of advocating that certain natural features should be completely off-limits to humans, should be preserved in an imagined pristine state, even if no one can experience them. Chinese philosophy tends more toward integration, toward the idea that human and natural are not opposed categories, but interpenetrating ones, that human appreciation and interpretation of natural beauty is itself valuable and legitimate, that enhancing nature through art is not necessarily destructive, but can be creative and appropriate. The Reed Flute Cave embodies this latter philosophy. The lighting, the naming, the pathways and infrastructure, all of this is human enhancement of natural beauty, human interpretation of natural form. Whether this is better or worse than leaving the cave in darkness, accessible only to those willing to explore it by flashlight or headlamp, is ultimately a question of values and priorities. Both approaches have merit. Both result in different but valid relationships between humans and the natural world. What is clear is that the cave has become an economic resource for Guilin, a draw for tourists, a source of employment and revenue. The region has dozens of caves, but Reed Flute is among the most famous, most visited, most promoted. Its image appears in countless advertisements and travel articles. It has become synonymous with Guilin tourism alongside the Li River and the karst peaks. This economic role matters. It provides justification for preservation, resources for maintenance, motivation to protect the cave from more destructive uses. Without tourism revenue, the cave might be quarried for limestone or simply ignored and left to decay, its inscriptions fading, its formations damaged by vandals or accidents. The economic value creates stakeholders who benefit from the cave's continued existence and appeal, who have reason to invest in its preservation and proper management. This is not pure altruism, it is enlightened self-interest, recognition that the cave is worth more intact and functional than destroyed or neglected. But enlightened self-interest is often sufficient motivation for good stewardship. The management of the Reed Flute Cave has evolved over the decades since it opened to tourism. Early approaches were sometimes crude: excessive lighting, inadequate protection of formations, insufficient environmental monitoring. But experience accumulated. Managers learned what worked and what didn't, what practices led to deterioration and what practices supported preservation. International best practices for cave management were adopted and adapted to local conditions. The result is not perfect. No heavily visited cave can be perfectly preserved, but it represents a reasonable balance between access and protection, between use and conservation. Recent years have brought new challenges. Climate change is affecting karst systems globally, altering precipitation patterns, changing groundwater chemistry, potentially affecting formation growth rates and cave atmospherics. The specific impacts on Reed Flute Cave are not yet fully understood. This requires long-term monitoring and research, requires baseline data against which changes can be measured. But there is awareness that the stable conditions that have existed for thousands of years may not persist, that the cave's future may be different from its past. Additionally, visitor expectations and behaviors are changing. The rise of social media has made photography and video documentation central to many people's experience of the cave.
This creates pressure for better lighting, for places where good photos can be taken, for the cave to be Instagrammable and shareable. At the same time, the desire for authentic, unique experiences creates demand for areas of the cave that are less developed, less touristy, more real. Managing these competing demands requires careful thought and planning.
The cave's role in education should not be overlooked. For many visitors, particularly school groups, the Reed Flute Cave provides a tangible introduction to geology, to the power of water in shaping landscapes, to the timescales involved in earth processes. Seeing formations that took hundreds of thousands of years to grow makes deep time concrete in a way that textbooks cannot. Understanding that this landscape was once a seabed, that the stone surrounding you was formed from ancient marine organisms, connects present to past in visceral ways. Educational materials and interpretive signage in the cave could be enhanced. Currently, most information is provided by tour guides, whose training and knowledge levels vary. Supplementing this with written materials, with QR codes that visitors can scan for more detailed information, with augmented reality applications that could overlay geological or historical information on the physical space, would increase educational value. Such enhancements must be balanced against the desire not to clutter the cave with excessive technology or information, not to distract from the direct experience of the space. But thoughtful educational enhancement can deepen appreciation without diminishing it. The relationship between the Reed Flute Cave and Chinese artistic traditions deserves deeper exploration. The karst landscapes of the Guilin region have influenced Chinese painting for over 1,000 years. The distinctive shapes of the limestone towers, the mists that often hang in the valleys, the interplay of rock and water, all of these appear repeatedly in landscape paintings, in scroll paintings, in the work of both ancient and modern artists. The caves themselves, while less frequently depicted, are part of this aesthetic tradition. Classical Chinese landscape painting, called shan sui, mountain water, seeks to capture not just the physical appearance of landscapes, but their essence, their spirit, the emotional and philosophical content of natural scenes. Mountains represent stability, endurance, the masculine principle, yang. Water represents change, adaptability, the feminine principle, yin. Together, they form the fundamental duality of the natural world, the interaction between permanent and changing, solid and fluid, earth and water. Caves occupy an interesting place in this cosmology. They are mountains that are simultaneously hollow, solid stone that contains void. They are dry spaces where water is nonetheless the dominant presence, the sculptor, the creator. They are dark yet can be illuminated, are hidden yet can be revealed. These dualities and paradoxes make caves philosophically rich spaces, places where apparent opposites coexist, where normal categories break down. The specific aesthetic of the Reed Flute Cave, with its elaborate formations and colored lights, connects to Chinese decorative traditions, to the love of ornament and detail, to the idea that beauty is something to be elaborated and celebrated rather than minimized or hidden. This is different from certain Western aesthetic traditions that value simplicity and understatement, that see ornament as excessive or decadent. Neither approach is inherently superior, they simply reflect different cultural values, different ways of relating to beauty and nature. Chinese literature, particularly poetry, frequently references caves as places of retreat, meditation, and transcendence. The poet-sage withdrawing to a mountain cave to escape the corruptions of society, to seek enlightenment, to commune with nature, this is a recurring trope in Chinese literary culture. The Tang Dynasty, when many of the inscriptions in the Reed Flute Cave were written, was a golden age of Chinese poetry, and caves feature in the work of major poets like Li Bai and Du Fu. These literary associations add layers of meaning to the cave.
When a Chinese visitor with knowledge of this literary tradition enters the Reed Flute Cave, they bring with them centuries of cultural resonance, references and associations that enrich the experience, that connect the physical space to philosophical and poetic traditions. This is part of why the naming of formations matters, why references to dragon palaces and scholars' studies are not just fanciful but meaningful. They activate these cultural connections, make the cave not just a geological feature, but a participant in ongoing cultural narratives. For visitors without this cultural background, some of this richness is inevitably lost. A Western tourist may see the formations as beautiful, but not understand the specific cultural meanings embedded in the naming and interpretation. This is not necessarily a problem. Beauty and wonder can be appreciated without cultural fluency, and the cave speaks to human sensibilities that transcend any single culture. But it does mean that different visitors are having somewhat different experiences, are engaging with different aspects of what the cave offers. The future of the Reed Flute Cave is uncertain, as is the future of all tourist destinations in an era of rapid environmental and economic change. Climate change, as mentioned, could alter the conditions that maintain the cave's formations and atmosphere. Economic changes could shift tourism patterns. China's growing domestic tourism market provides a solid base of visitors, but international tourism is more volatile, subject to political, economic, and public health disruptions.
The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated this volatility. International tourism to China essentially stopped for several years, and even domestic tourism was significantly disrupted by lockdowns and travel restrictions. Tourist sites like the Reed Flute Cave saw dramatically reduced visitor numbers, which had both positive and negative effects. The positive, the cave got a break from the constant impact of tourism, allowing some natural recovery. The negative, the loss of revenue, threatened the resources available for maintenance and conservation, potentially putting the cave at risk from neglect rather than overuse. As tourism recovers, the question becomes whether to return to previous levels or to aim for a more sustainable model with lower visitor numbers, but perhaps higher per-visitor revenue and lower per-visitor impact. This requires making difficult choices about access, about who gets to visit and under what circumstances, about how to balance the democratic ideal that natural wonders should be available to everyone with the practical reality that unlimited access can lead to degradation. Some have proposed reservation systems that would limit daily visitor numbers, ensuring that the cave is never overcrowded, that each visitor group has space and time to appreciate the formations without being rushed or overwhelmed by crowds. This would likely mean higher ticket prices to compensate for reduced volume, which raises equity concerns, making the cave accessible only to those who can afford premium prices. But it would also improve the visitor experience and reduce environmental impact, creating genuine trade-offs with no perfect solution. Technology offers some potential approaches. Virtual reality could allow people to experience the cave without physically visiting it, reducing the impact of mass tourism while still providing access to the wonder and beauty of the formations. High-quality 3D scans and photogrammetry can create digital models of the cave accurate enough that exploring them in VR provides much of the experience of physical presence. This technology is already being used for some fragile or dangerous caves that cannot accommodate large numbers of visitors. Could it supplement or partially replace physical visitation at Reed Flute Cave? The answer depends partly on what we value about the experience. If the goal is primarily visual appreciation, to see the formations and understand their beauty, then high-quality virtual experiences could satisfy that goal for many people. But if the value includes the physical sensations, the coolness of the air, the humidity, the sounds of water dripping, the sense of being actually underground, the scale and three-dimensionality that is difficult to fully capture in any mediated form, then virtual experiences, however sophisticated, will always be a pale substitute for direct presence.
Perhaps the answer is not either or, but both and. Virtual experiences could make the cave accessible to people who cannot physically visit, those with mobility issues, those who cannot afford the travel, those who are geographically distant. They could also serve as educational tools, allowing detailed study and repeated virtual visits that would not be possible or appropriate in the physical cave. Meanwhile, physical visitation could continue, but at managed levels, with visitors understanding that they are privileged to access something precious and limited, something that must be protected even as it is experienced. The inscriptions on the cave walls remind us that people have been visiting this cave and feeling compelled to mark their presence for over 1,000 years. This impulse, to leave a mark, to claim some tiny immortality, to assert, "I was here," is ancient and universal. The Tang Dynasty poets who brushed their names and verses onto the stone were doing essentially what modern tourists do with selfies and social media posts, just using different technology. Both are ways of saying, "I witnessed this, I was present for this, my existence briefly intersected with this extraordinary place." But there is a difference. The Tang inscriptions became part of the cave's history, added a layer of human meaning to the natural formation, became artifacts of historical and cultural value in themselves. Modern graffiti, names scratched into formations, initials carved into flowstone, is just damage, vandalism that detracts from the cave without adding meaningful content. The distinction is partly about execution, partly about cultural acceptance, partly about the passage of time that turns contemporary acts into historical artifacts. But it is also about intention and thoughtfulness, about whether the mark-making adds anything or simply defaces. In a sense, the entire modern tourist development, the lights, the pathways, the infrastructure, is an elaborate inscription, a way of saying humanity was here, engaged with this place, found it meaningful. Whether this inscription is as legitimate as the Tang poems or as illegitimate as carved graffiti is again a matter of perspective, but it is certainly transformative. The Reed Flute Cave we experience today is not the cave as it existed before human intervention. It is a collaboration between nature and culture, between geological process and human interpretation.
And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps pure preservation, the idea that nature should exist untouched and uninterpreted, is itself a cultural construct, one particular way of valuing the natural world, but not the only way, or necessarily the best way. Perhaps human engagement with natural beauty, human attempts to enhance and interpret and understand it are also valid, are also part of what it means to be conscious beings in a physical world that is both our home and other than us, both the context for our lives and something that transcends human concerns entirely. The Reed Flute Cave will endure these philosophical debates. It existed before them, will exist after them. The formations will continue their infinitesimal growth if conditions remain suitable, will cease growing if they do not. The cave does not care whether we light it with colored lights or leave it dark, whether we visit in crowds or not at all, whether we see it as pristine nature to be preserved or as raw material for aesthetic experience to be enhanced. It simply is. Limestone and calcite, void and stone, the product of water and time, beautiful and indifferent, waiting in the darkness for the next drip, the next molecule of dissolved calcium carbonate to precipitate out and add its microscopic thickness to formations already ancient, already magnificent, already complete and yet never finished, always growing, always changing, always becoming what they are becoming, patient beyond any human conception of patience, enduring beyond any human span of caring. We visit the cave. We are moved by it, or we are not. We photograph it, we remember it, we tell others about it. We add our small experience to the accumulated human history of engagement with this place, and then we leave, and the cave remains, and the water drips, and the minerals precipitate, and the formations grow their microns, and the deep time of geology continues, indifferent to our presence or absence, continuing the work it has been doing for millennia and will do for millennia more,
until the climate shifts too dramatically, or the hydrology changes, or the cave fills with sediment, or the hillside erodes away entirely, or any of the 1,000 geological events that can end a cave's active life occurs. But not yet. Not today. Today, the cave lives, grows, continues, and today we can visit, can descend into the colored darkness, can witness what water and time have wrought, can stand in the presence of something genuinely ancient and genuinely beautiful, can feel small and momentary against such vastness, and yet somehow enlarged by the encounter, by the privilege of witnessing, by the gift of being conscious beings capable of apprehending beauty and meaning in arrangements of stone that have no knowledge of beauty or meaning, that simply are what they are, that exist because the laws of chemistry and physics and the specific conditions of this particular limestone hillside have caused them to exist. This is the Reed Flute Cave, rainbow labyrinth of stalactites and ink, natural cathedral lit in technicolor, ancient refuge and modern tourist attraction, geological wonder and cultural artifact, pristine nature and human interpretation, eternal and ephemeral, silent and speaking, hollow heart of the stone, water's patient sculpture, time made visible, beauty made accessible, darkness made light. The story of how formations grow in the Reed Flute Cave, of how water performs its slow alchemy, transforming dissolved minerals into solid stone, deserves deeper examination. Because this process, while understood in its broad principles, contains within it such precise requirements, such delicate balances of chemistry and physics, that the existence of elaborate cave formations anywhere feels almost miraculous, and their existence in such profusion here feels like a conspiracy of favorable circumstances operating over geological time. Begin with rain. Water falls from clouds onto the landscape above the cave, onto the soil and vegetation covering the limestone hill. This water is not chemically neutral. It has already absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, forming a weak solution of carbonic acid. As it percolates through the soil, it encounters more carbon dioxide, produced by decaying organic matter and by the respiration of soil organisms. The water becomes more acidic, more capable of dissolving calcium carbonate. When this acidified water reaches the limestone bedrock beneath the soil, the dissolution begins. Calcium carbonate, the primary constituent of limestone, is only slightly soluble in pure water, but in acidic water, the reaction proceeds readily. The carbonic acid reacts with the calcium carbonate, forming calcium bicarbonate, which is much more soluble and can be carried in solution. This is the fundamental reaction that creates caves, that hollows out limestone, that over millions of years can dissolve away entire mountains. The water, now carrying dissolved calcium and bicarbonate ions, percolates through fractures and pores in the limestone, working its way downward under the influence of gravity. Some of it moves through the rock matrix itself, seeping slowly through tiny spaces between mineral grains. Other water follows larger fractures and fissures, moving more quickly through pathways opened by previous dissolution. The cave system is a drainage network for this water, a collection point for seepage from a large area of the surrounding rock.
When the water reaches the cave, emerges through the ceiling or walls into the open air of the chambers, the chemistry reverses. The cave air has lower carbon dioxide concentration than the water, and carbon dioxide begins to escape from the solution, like bubbles emerging from an opened bottle of carbonated beverage, though much more slowly. As the carbon dioxide escapes, the calcium bicarbonate becomes unstable, converts back to calcium carbonate, which is insoluble and precipitates out as solid calcite. This precipitated calcite is what builds the formations. Each drop of water that seeps through the ceiling deposits a tiny amount of mineral. If the drop hangs from the ceiling for a time before falling, it deposits calcite in a ring around the water drop, gradually building a hollow tube called a soda straw stalactite. These are fragile formations, rarely more than a few millimeters in diameter, but they can grow quite long, up to several meters in some caves. If the hollow center of a soda straw becomes blocked, or if water begins flowing over the outside of the formation, the stalactite becomes more massive, building up layers of calcite, thickening, becoming the classic cone-shaped stalactite we associate with caves. The shape is determined by the flow pattern of the water. Fast dripping water produces longer, thinner stalactites, while slower seepage with more lateral spreading produces wider, more massive formations. Meanwhile, water falling from the ceiling to the floor carries dissolved minerals that have not yet precipitated. When the drop hits the floor, more carbon dioxide is released through the impact and agitation, causing additional calcite to precipitate at the point of impact. This builds upward, creating a stalagmite rising from the floor. The shape of stalagmites is typically wider and more robust than stalactites because the water splashes and spreads when it hits, depositing calcite over a broader area. If a stalactite and its corresponding stalagmite continue growing for long enough, tens or hundreds of thousands of years typically, they will eventually meet and merge, forming a column that connects floor to ceiling. The Reed Flute Cave contains numerous such columns, some of them several meters in diameter, representing extraordinary spans of continuous formation under stable conditions. But stalactites and stalagmites are just two types among many formation styles. Flowstone forms when water flows in sheets down walls or along floors rather than dripping from points. This creates smooth, flowing surfaces, often with ripples and waves frozen in stone, textures that resemble liquid despite being solid mineral. The colors in flowstone come from impurities in the water. Iron compounds create oranges and reds, manganese create blacks and grays, copper creates blues and greens. Pure calcite is white or translucent, but pure calcite is rare. Most cave formations contain trace amounts of other minerals that tint them. Draperies or curtains form when water flows down from an inclined ceiling, depositing calcite along a line, building thin, wavy sheets of stone. Some draperies in the Reed Flute Cave are translucent, thin enough that light passes through them, creating glowing panels of stone when backlit by the colored lights. These are among the most delicate formations, easily damaged by touch or vibration, preserved only because the cave has remained relatively stable. Helictites are formations that grow in odd directions, seeming to defy gravity, twisting and curving in ways that appear impossible for stone formed by dripping water. Their formation mechanism is still not completely understood, but it likely involves capillary action and crystalline growth forces, with water seeping through tiny pores in the formation itself rather than dripping over the surface. The Reed Flute Cave has examples of helictites, though they are not the dominant formation type here. Cave popcorn or cave coral consists of small, bumpy deposits that form on walls and formations, creating a rough, nodular texture. These form through evaporation and condensation processes, with moisture seeping through the cave walls and evaporating on the surface, leaving behind tiny calcite deposits. Over time, these accumulate into the distinctive popcorn texture visible in many areas of the cave. All of these formations require specific conditions to form and continue growing. The water must be saturated with calcium carbonate, but not supersaturated to the point of rapid, disorganized precipitation. The temperature must be stable. Large temperature fluctuations disrupt the delicate chemistry. The humidity must be high. If the cave dries out, formation growth ceases. The carbon dioxide levels in the cave air must be lower than in the water, but not so low that precipitation is too rapid. And these conditions must persist not for years, but for millennia, for hundreds of thousands of years for the elaborate formations to develop. The Reed Flute Cave has had these favorable conditions for much of its existence. The subtropical climate of the Guilin region provides abundant rainfall, ensuring consistent water flow through the limestone. The cave's depth and configuration maintain stable temperature and humidity. The vegetation on the hillside above produces the carbon dioxide that acidifies the infiltrating water. All of these factors have remained aligned through ice ages and interglacials, through climate fluctuations and environmental changes for long enough that the cave is filled with formations, that nearly every surface is decorated with secondary mineral deposits.
But formation growth is not uniform throughout the cave. Some areas are densely decorated, while others are relatively bare. This reflects variations in water flow patterns, in the specific hydrology of the rock above different parts of the cave. Areas receiving consistent seepage become elaborately decorated. Areas where water flows rarely or only during high rainfall events remain less decorated. The distribution of formations thus maps the hydrology of the rock above, reveals patterns of fracturing and permeability, tells a story about how water moves through this particular volume of limestone. The formations also record environmental history. Their growth rates vary with climate. More rainfall means more water flowing through the system, potentially faster growth. Drier periods mean less water, slower growth, or cessation of growth. Changes in the water chemistry due to changes in vegetation above the cave, or changes in atmospheric chemistry, or changes in the minerals available in the rock alter the color and composition of the deposited calcite. Reading this history requires sophisticated analysis, cutting formations and examining them under microscopes, measuring isotopic ratios, dating layers using radioactive decay of trace uranium incorporated into the calcite. But the information is there, encoded in the stone, waiting to be read. Some formations in the Reed Flute Cave show evidence of multiple growth phases, periods of active formation separated by periods when growth ceased. These interruptions might result from climate shifts that dried the cave temporarily, or from changes in the groundwater flow patterns that redirected water away from particular formations. The formations that have persisted through multiple growth phases are the oldest, the most resilient, having survived not just geological time, but geological changes. The oldest formations in the cave might be 500,000 years old or more, though dating them precisely is difficult. The youngest active formations, those still receiving water, still growing, are adding to themselves right now, at this moment, molecule by molecule. A water drop hangs from a stalactite tip, heavy with dissolved minerals. Carbon dioxide escapes from it into the cave air. Calcium carbonate precipitates out, deposits as a microscopically thin layer of calcite on the formation's surface. The drop falls, strikes the stalagmite below, deposits more calcite there. The process repeats thousands of times per day, millions of times per year, billions of times over geological timescales, and the formation grows. The rate is almost incomprehensibly slow. A stalactite might grow 1 centimeter in a century under typical conditions. The massive formations in the Reed Flute Cave, several meters long, represent dozens or hundreds of centuries of continuous growth. This is patient creation, accumulation so gradual that it would be invisible to human observation, that requires geological patience to appreciate. And yet, the result is not just large, but intricate. The formations are not simple cones or cylinders, but complex shapes with texture and variation at every scale. Zoom in close to the surface of a stalactite, and you see tiny ridges and ripples, evidence of how each layer was deposited. Zoom in further, and you see the crystalline structure of the calcite itself, the geometric arrangement of atoms that gives the mineral its properties. At every level of magnification, there is detail, there is structure, there is information about how this particular piece of stone came to have its particular form. This complexity emerges from simple rules applied consistently over time. The water seeps, the minerals precipitate, the formation grows. No consciousness directs it, no intention shapes it, no designer decides where each molecule will go. Yet the result is ordered, is patterned, is beautiful in ways that human aesthetic sensibility recognizes and values. This is emergence, complex patterns and structures arising from simple processes, order from chaos, beauty from chemistry. The formations in the Reed Flute Cave are not unique. Every limestone cave in the right climate and with the right hydrology will develop similar features. Yet each cave is also unique. The specific shapes and sizes and distributions of formations resulting from the specific details of that cave's geology and hydrology and history. The Reed Flute Cave is one instance of a general process, one variation on a theme played out in thousands of caves worldwide. But it is also singular, unrepeatable, the only cave that formed in exactly this rock, with exactly this history, producing exactly these formations. This balance between universal and particular, between the cave as example of general principles and the cave as unique place, is philosophically interesting. The formations teach us about karst processes, about calcite deposition, about cave development, universal knowledge applicable to caves everywhere. But they are also this specific cave, this particular arrangement of stone, this individual place with its own character and meaning. Both perspectives are valid and necessary. The cave is both general and specific, both representative and unique.
The living biology of the cave, while less visually dramatic than the formations, is equally remarkable in its way. Caves are generally considered harsh environments for life. No sunlight penetrates, so photosynthesis is impossible, meaning the base of the food chain that supports most surface ecosystems doesn't exist. Cave organisms must rely on energy and organic matter brought in from outside, either by flowing water or by animals that enter the cave. In the Reed Flute Cave, the primary energy sources are organic matter dissolved in the seeping water, bat guano, where bats use the cave, and the microorganisms that enter with tourists. Various bacteria and fungi colonize surfaces, breaking down organic compounds, forming the base of the cave's limited food web. These microorganisms support small invertebrates, cave crickets, spiders, tiny crustaceans in the pools and streams, organisms adapted to life in perpetual darkness. True cave-adapted species, called troglobites, have evolved distinctive features: loss of eyes and pigmentation, elongated appendages, reduced metabolism, long lifespans. The Reed Flute Cave likely hosts some such species, though comprehensive biological surveys have not been conducted, or at least not widely published. Cave biology is a specialized field, requiring expertise to identify species that are often small, rare, and difficult to distinguish from surface relatives. The colored lights in the cave have created a new ecosystem component, photosynthetic life where it normally cannot exist. Algae and cyanobacteria grow on surfaces near the lights, using the artificial illumination for photosynthesis. This creates green and brown discolorations on formations, particularly on the white calcite that would naturally be pristine. This is one of the unintended consequences of the lighting system, one of the trade-offs between providing spectacular visual experiences and maintaining natural conditions. Cave managers periodically clean the algae, scrubbing formations to remove the photosynthetic growth, but it grows back, a constant battle between the desire for clean white formations and the inevitable colonization that occurs when you provide light in an environment that is naturally dark. Some caves have moved to LED lighting systems that emit less of the spectrum usable by photosynthetic organisms, reducing but not eliminating algae growth.
Whether the Reed Flute Cave will make this transition depends on cost-benefit calculations, on whether the reduction in algae justifies the expense of replacing the entire lighting system. The cave's atmosphere is another critical factor in its preservation. Caves typically have very stable air with little exchange with the outside atmosphere, constant temperature and humidity, and elevated carbon dioxide levels from the respiration of cave organisms and from the limestone itself. The Reed Flute Cave's development for tourism has disrupted this stability. Doors are opened and closed, allowing air exchange. HVAC systems circulate air to make the environment comfortable for visitors, and the body heat and respiration of thousands of daily visitors alter the temperature and chemistry. These changes can affect formation growth. If the carbon dioxide levels in the cave air increase too much, the deposition of calcite slows or stops. The chemistry requires a difference in carbon dioxide concentration between the water and the air for precipitation to occur. If the humidity drops too much, formations dry out and cease growing. If the temperature fluctuates significantly, the delicate chemical balances are disrupted. Monitoring these atmospheric parameters is essential for proper cave management. Sensors track temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels continuously, providing data that managers use to adjust ventilation systems, limit visitor numbers during sensitive periods, and understand the cave's response to tourism pressure. This is adaptive management, using ongoing monitoring to inform decisions, adjusting practices based on observed outcomes, treating the cave as a dynamic system that requires constant attention rather than a static resource that can be exploited without consequences. The question of how many visitors the Reed Flute Cave can sustainably accommodate has no simple answer. It depends on what we mean by sustainable. Are we trying to maintain current formation growth rates or simply prevent active degradation? Are we prioritizing the formations themselves or the overall cave ecosystem, including biology and atmospheric conditions? Different goals lead to different carrying capacity estimates. Some cave scientists argue that any tourism impact is too much, that caves should be accessible only for scientific research, that the only truly sustainable approach is to close caves to general visitation. This is a defensible position. It prioritizes preservation absolutely, treats the cave as having intrinsic value that supersedes human recreational desires. But it is also an elitist position in some sense, reserving cave access to a scientific priesthood while denying it to the broader public who might also value and appreciate these natural wonders. Other approaches seek middle ground, limited visitation, carefully managed, with robust monitoring and adaptive management to minimize impacts. This is more democratic, allows more people to experience caves, but requires constant vigilance and investment in proper management. The Reed Flute Cave attempts this middle path, though whether successfully is debatable and depends on the metrics used to judge success.
The cave's role in local and regional culture extends beyond tourism economics. For the people of Guilin, the Reed Flute Cave is part of their heritage, part of what defines their region, part of their identity. The cave appears in local art and literature, is taught about in schools, is a source of civic pride. This cultural ownership creates stakeholders beyond the tourism industry, people who care about the cave for reasons beyond immediate economic benefit. This cultural embedding can support conservation. When a community values a natural feature as part of their identity and heritage, they are more likely to support protective measures, more likely to resist destructive uses, more likely to invest in preservation. The cave becomes not just a resource to be exploited, but a treasure to be protected, a legacy to be passed to future generations in good condition. But cultural pride can also create pressure for development and access, for making the cave available and impressive, for enhancements and modifications that serve cultural or nationalist purposes.
The tension between preservation and presentation, between protecting the cave and making it a showcase, can be acute when national or regional pride is involved. The cave becomes a stage for cultural display, a way of demonstrating achievements and sophistication, and this can lead to excessive development, over-lighting, over-interpretation, modifications that prioritize visitor experience over natural conditions. The Reed Flute Cave has navigated these tensions with mixed success. The lighting system is undeniably impressive, draws visitors, creates memorable experiences, but it has also altered the cave significantly, transformed it from a natural feature into an art installation, a collaborative work between geology and human aesthetic interpretation. Whether this is appropriate stewardship or cultural vandalism depends on your perspective, on how you weight the values of preservation versus access, of natural authenticity versus enhanced experience. The cave's future will be shaped by decisions made in the coming decades. Will visitor numbers be capped or will growth continue? Will the lighting system be maintained in its current form or modified to reduce environmental impact? Will new chambers be opened to tourism or will development be limited to current areas? Will scientific research be prioritized and funded adequately? Will climate change significantly alter the cave's hydrology and formation growth? These questions have no predetermined answers. They will be resolved through the actions and choices of managers, policymakers, scientists, and the visiting public. One possible future is continued growth in tourism, with visitor numbers increasing as China's middle class expands and international travel resumes post-pandemic. This brings revenue and political support for the cave, but increases environmental pressures, requires ever more sophisticated management to prevent degradation, and potentially diminishes the quality of visitor experience as crowds grow. Another future is a turn toward conservation, with visitor numbers capped or even reduced, with parts of the cave closed to allow recovery, with management prioritizing long-term preservation over short-term tourism revenue. This would require political will and alternative economic development strategies for the region, since tourism revenue would decline. But it would give the cave the best chance of remaining relatively pristine, of continuing its natural formation processes, of being available for future generations to experience. A third possibility is gradual degradation, not catastrophic destruction, but slow accumulation of impacts, gradual darkening of formations from touching and pollutants, slow changes in the cave's atmosphere and hydrology, subtle loss of the features that make the cave special. This is perhaps the most likely scenario in the absence of proactive management, not intentional harm, but death by 1,000 small impacts, the tragedy of the commons playing out underground. The Reed Flute Cave, like all natural features open to tourism, exists in tension between competing values and interests. It is a natural wonder to be preserved, an economic resource to be utilized, a cultural heritage to be celebrated, an educational facility to be interpreted, a scientific laboratory to be studied. Balancing these roles requires wisdom, resources, political will, and a long-term perspective that looks beyond immediate benefits to consider what we want the cave to be decades and centuries from now. The ancient inscriptions remind us that people have been grappling with the cave's meaning for over a millennium. The Tang Dynasty visitors who wrote on the walls were not thinking about tourism management or carrying capacity or atmospheric chemistry. They were responding to beauty, seeking refuge, contemplating mortality and transcendence, leaving messages for posterity. Their inscriptions have outlasted their civilization, have survived dynastic changes and revolutions, have become historical artifacts in their own right.
What will our era leave? Not inscriptions in ink, that is now understood as vandalism, as damage to be prevented, but we leave our impacts nonetheless. The pathways in lighting, the algae in air circulation changes, the wear on formations from countless visitors, the photographic record that documents the cave's current state. These are our inscriptions, our messages to the future, whether we intend them as such or not. And the cave receives all of this, ancient ink and modern impacts, natural processes and human interventions with equal indifference. It existed before we named it, will exist after we are gone. The formations grow or cease growing based on chemistry and hydrology, not on human desires or plans. The cave is patient beyond any human conception of patience, operating on geological timescales where our entire tourist development, our entire civilization is a brief moment, a temporary condition, a passing phase. This perspective is humbling. We matter so little on geological scales, our actions so ephemeral, our concerns so temporary. The cave teaches patience, teaches perspective, teaches that there are time scales and processes that dwarf human history and human importance. This is one of the gifts of geological time made visible, the reminder that we are not the center, not the most important things, not the permanent features. We are temporary, brief, passing through a world that was here before us and will be here after us. Yet our experiences matter too. The wonder we feel, the beauty we perceive, the meanings we make. These are real, even if ephemeral. The cave may not care whether we visit or appreciate or protect it, but we care. Our caring matters to us, gives our lives texture and richness, connects us to something beyond ourselves. The cave serves this purpose, regardless of whether serving purposes is something caves do or care about. In the end, the Reed Flute Cave is what it is: limestone and calcite, void and stone, darkness and artificial light, natural process and human interpretation, ancient and contemporary, Chinese and universal, particular and representative, beautiful and indifferent. It is a place you can visit, a space you can enter, an experience you can have. It will affect you or not, mean something to you or not, be remembered or forgotten. The cave doesn't mind either way. It simply continues, grows its formations when conditions allow, receives its visitors when they come, exists whether anyone knows it or not. This is the Reed Flute Cave, rainbow labyrinth of stalactites and ink, water's patient sculpture, time made visible, stone made light, darkness revealed, earth's hollow palace, karst cathedral, formation festival, ancient refuge and modern attraction, geological wonder and cultural treasure, preserved and impacted, studied and experienced, photographed and remembered, existing in the limestone hills of Guilin, in the memory of visitors, in the record of science, in the flow of time, in the patient accumulation of calcite, in the slow sculpture of water, in the dark and the light, in the past and the present and the unknown future.